Yeah. Okay, so there's a better way for me to do it through Zoom. So I'm going to be able to have actual video from everything that I am going to be going over with you guys. So I hope that helps those recordings. I know I made a comment last time in Google Classroom about like, if you guys need more learning material, please ask. We do have 4 weeks together. I am going into a busy season for like my wedding work, but like I'm more than happy to create any of this stuff for you guys. I'm also not expecting you guys to have a whole bunch that you necessarily want to work on like at this first day of class. The option is there if you guys want it, essentially. So what I'm gonna do now is what I'm actually gonna do is I'm gonna edit some of my wedding work, and we're gonna go along with that. And then I'm basically gonna walk through my steps and processes of editing. I think with editing, it can be a little daunting for a lot of people because there's just so many options and there's so many ways of doing things that I think like it can be a little there might be like this feeling that you have to use everything that's available to you guys. Not necessarily the case. I think when it comes to editing, we just need to start paying attention to what we are trying to actually reveal, in terms of our detail, like what is it about our image that we want to show more of. And then when we reveal detail, we're essentially taking away contrast. So we reveal detail, we take away contrast, you know what I mean? And then we have to kind of put contrast back in there, if that makes sense, right? So with editing, it kind of comes down to what's called like a push and pull. Essentially you're going to be pulling information from one side, pushing it back into another, so on and so forth. This way you can get some people in here. Essentially, that's what editing is, right? There are some parameters that are going to help us understand how to edit better. Okay, person waiting to come in, and we'll go from there. Okay, cool. So I'm gonna be editing through Lightroom Classic. When you're editing in Lightroom Mobile, obviously the layout on my computer isn't gonna look the exact same, but the sliders are more or less gonna be in the same order. All editing programs more or less have very similar names for their different editing sliders, and for the most part, they work just about the same. If you're using your like the iPhone photo editing option through iPhone, it'll work. You have some of the same sliders. It's just not as it just doesn't give you the full kind of control that I would prefer as someone who's a professional photographer and loves to have full control over their work. That's just why I recommend it, the most. It's definitely gives you the best option for being able to edit your images. And especially if you get to the point where you're trying to remove things in the background, if you've ever messed with generative AI remove, it is the best. It honestly works the best, right? I don't like teaching it because I think once I start teaching how to remove stuff in like my normal destination classes, people get a little carried away with that. But I'm going to show you all how that works because it's very easy and it's very straightforward. It's very helpful. Okay, I think we might just be. Let me just do one last screenshot to get who's all here, guys. One sec. And we are off. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and start sharing my screen here. I am gonna pick, where do I want to go? What was
Excuse me.
Okay,
Sorry.
they're all good.
I don't know if it's a problem, but I'm signed like iPad of Marty, but I'm Martina Dem. I don't know how to change my name.
No, you're okay. I got you. I figured as
Okay.
much. Yeah, yeah. With that stuff, like, I just essentially take a screenshot of all your nice smiling faces so that I know that you guys are here and participating. So But yeah, just like last time, guys, I get very focused on what I'm talking about. So if you see someone who needs to get let in, let me know so I can go ahead and do that. I don't want to forget about anybody. All of you are very important to me, so I want to make sure that everybody's able to be in the class as necessary. So I'm just trying to pick which I think would be a fun one to look at with you guys. Yeah, let's do this one. All right, so this is on the west side of the island, a little place called Secret Beach. This is some of the wedding photos I did, an elopement I did over there. Woohoo, fun stuff. So I'm just gonna go ahead and some of these are already edited, so I'm just gonna kind of reset them so that we can kind of work from there. Let's go reset version. I'll just do it this way. Reset everything. All right. Actually, yeah, no, that's fine. Okay, so with editing, guys, actually, so let me find another photo that isn't have anything on it. How do I reset this completely? There we go. Okay, so this is my raw image, guys. This is what my camera looks like, obviously with my blank image here, right? So when it comes to editing, first and foremost, guys, like the what you really want to do is you want to organize, right? Before you even get to editing, you want to organize your work so that when you're editing and going through, your images, you want to make sure you're only working on the ones that matter, right? So let's look down here. This is from just like 1 hour session. I have 601 photos, right? Taken from just this 1 hour session. If you guys want to think about it in terms of time, right? If I was to spend 1 minute on 601 photos, how much time is that? A ridiculous amount of time, right? I'm not expecting you to have like the full whatever conversion for that. But my point is that, with editing, especially because we're going to be doing a lot of granular things and paying attention to color and all this, like it can get taxing over time the longer you do it. Personally, I try not to edit for more than like 2 hours in a row just because like it does take a lot on your eyes, especially staring at screens. Um, First and foremost, going back to going to screens though. So when with editing, there's a couple of things you really want to be take care of beforehand, right? Sorting your photos is the first step, right? I have a system here where I color code it and I do by like numbers, stars, whatever. Find a way that works for you. Um, Make an album of your favorite photos so that when you go to edit, that's what you're going to focus on, right? Just because that is going to speed up the process quite a bit. So after you go ahead and pick your photos, honestly, like one of the first things after you go ahead and select your photos before you even, kind of get to it is you're going to play around with the crop, right? So for me, admit, cropping is like one of the best places to start, right? This is why I talked to you guys yesterday about, turning on your grid display because the grid display is going to make a huge difference, right? Just in terms of getting everything balanced. So looking at this image, right, it's a little dark. There's not much I can do. It doesn't look like much right now. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to raise the exposure first just so I can see all the detail in my image, right? There's my people. That's Mike. This is an old guy officiate. He's funny, cool, right? And now I'm just going to kind of play around with the crop and then try to get this balanced a little bit, play around with it. So like part of the idea with like the rule of thirds is that if you have your main subject like lined up in these intersecting points, it's supposed to make your photo more visually interesting somehow. I don't know the exact science or like the reason why. It's just tends to be like a balance thing, right? So it's subtle, right? But it adds a lot to the balance of your photos to kind of put things in those right places. And see, I'm playing around with where I have that line coming through here, intersecting here in balance, right? That's one way to do it. What I like to do too, and this is very like kind of, nitpicky, is to me each of these frames is a photo, right? So if I was to, look at these and try to balance it out, I could look at each of these as an individual part of the image, right? This image itself doesn't necessarily work. I'm using more of the lines, but that's just the concept that I pay attention to that helps, right? So starting from this image, right? Okay, I raised the exposure just so I can see, right? I did my crop first, right? So this is where I would start, in terms of editing from here. So first things first, after I get, pick my photos, I raise exposure, I play with the crop so I can see a little bit. Now I'm going to start looking at what it is about my image that I want to reveal, right? So before that, do you guys see this graph up here, right? So this graph is called the histogram. The histogram is essentially, it's just a graph that tells you where all the detail in your image is, right? So with Lightroom Mobile, I'm able to grab specifically on here. So I'm going to try to move the sliders here so that it makes more sense for you guys visually to see what I'm doing. But if we look at this image, right, So this is your blacks on the very left. You have your shadows. Your here it says exposure, but that's your midtones. When your midtones are the parts of your image that's between your highlights and your shadows, right? So that's going to be like your people, your subjects, texture, the things in your image, right? Midtones, highlights, and then whites, right? Blacks on the very left, whites on the very right, shadows, midtones, highlights, whites. Pay attention to that. That is super important. That is going to come back up. That is just a very common, left to right thing when you think about detail, right? So keeping this in mind, this is going to help me understand where a lot of the detail in my image is and what I can do with my image, right? It is helpful. It is something to help guide your editing, but it doesn't need to be everything that you need to follow, right? Because in circumstances like this, especially because I have a very bright sky, my histogram is going to look very flat, right? I'll try to find another image later on. Let me see if I can find one real quick without so much sky. You see how this kind of spikes more on the top. So because I don't have that super bright, you know, this right. Oh, that one is where was it? Right, because of the extra bright sky that I had in there, right? It's gonna make my histogram look like a little bit different versus, like that photo where I had just the people itself, right? See, I have the less highlights, it's going to peak a little bit more. So that's why I just want to point this out, just because it can get a little confusing if you're trying to follow everything to a T, right? Not entirely necessary. Just use it as a guide to help you, right? Okay, cool. So going back to this image, this one, that doesn't matter. Okay, so here, right, we're looking at this image. Make sure it's all reset. So I just raise the exposure. That way I can see what I'm working with, right? So before I even go into my global edits, which I'll go here in a second, the first thing after all that I go to and mess around with is actually going to be your color temperature, right? So when we think about color temperature, when things are warmer, they tend to get what? Orange, right? Yellow, right? If you notice as I slowly kind of come up, you should see the colors of your image also start to brighten up. A warmer image is going to have brighter colors, right? So this is part of the reason why I start with color temperature, because in the same sense, a warmer image is going to have brighter colors. A cooler image is going to have more muted colors, right? And why it's important to start with your color temperature as one of the first things you do is because color temperature also refers to what is called your white balance, right? And that is essentially your camera's like your image's level of what you consider to be the color white, right? So if you look at this image right now, this is white, right? Like I think objectively speaking, if I zoom in here, we look at this guy's shirt, you know what I mean? His shirt, my here, like that's the color white, right? So this could be seen as a proper white balance. And guys, I do air quotes a lot. And the reason being is because photography, so there's so much that's relative and like your personal take on it, right? There's so many right and wrong ways necessarily to do things, right? And it really comes down to personal interpretation. For me, yes, this is a proper white, but this isn't the kind of white balance that I would want, right? Because when you set your white balance to a certain point, right, all of your other colors are going to kind of fall in line and be based off of that color temperature, if that makes sense, right? So that's why getting it set to a point where you want it to be first is super helpful. And if you're not, well versed on that, guys, shoot an auto white balance. You should be shooting an auto white, and with your phones, it's going to be auto white balance for the most part, right? For your cameras, you can set your white balance, your standard cameras, I mean. But while you're learning, it isn't exactly important because here in post, that's something that we can change, right? And then look up here at my histogram. As I make it warmer, do you see how things move around? Right? You think as I make it cooler, you see how things move around? Right? So this just goes back to what I'm talking about with like that push and pull of detail to figure out where you want to put, all of your information in your image, right? That's your color temperature. Underneath here, you have something called tint. Now, what tint refers to is that all light, for the most part, guys, has a cast of color, meaning that there's always a little bit of some color cast into all kinds of lights, right? Even if you guys were to scroll down and look at each other's video right now, like if you look at Michelle's light is what his reflection, it's warm, it's yellow, right? It's casting more of a yellow light on him, right? I can see maybe even a touch of green. Going down to who is this? To Vivian, right? If you look at Vivian's, right, her stuff just got darker, but you can see like there's a little bit of green tinge to the light that's around her, right? So this is why tint is important, right? Because you got to look for these different color casts. And here it's a super, super subtle green, right? When I zoom in. And if you want to balance that out, that's where the tint slider comes in. Because when you think about color, guys, if you're trying to balance out or like remove a certain type of color, you have to think about what the opposing color is. If you want to boost a certain color, you want to go with the complementary color. We're going to get more into that later. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. But look, if I just raise this all to the right, what happens? It gets super pink. Raise all the way to the left, it gets super green, right? If you go that far, it's going to look ridiculous, right? But it's not meant to, it's all about subtlety, right? So for this image, let me go, let's maybe right about there. I think I like that, right? And it's subtle, but there's a little bit of green cast. So if I just raise my tint a little bit, you see how it kind of brings out a little bit more of that rosiness, like of their skin, right? So this is before, right? You can really see it in the sand, like that green, right? And then this is what I did after. And as soon as I introduced that tint, it really, well, I like a little bit more of that rosy color anyway, so I naturally tend to gravitate towards more tint. But to me, it really kind of balanced out that white balance and made it look a little bit more natural for what I want, right? And that's just the first start, right? Does anybody have any questions about color temperature or anything that I just went over real quick? Thumbs up, guys. We're all good. Yeah. Yeah, guys, if I ask this question, just give me a thumbs up or just go ahead and write your question in
I
the
have
chat.
one
That way I know.
question.
Yes, of course.
So is it true that like every photographer has their own style? Like some of them are going in some color themes and some of them like, you know what I mean?
No,
Like,
absolutely. Yeah, yeah, that's a good question. So style is super relative, right? And it is true that everybody has their own style. I will say this much, depending on what niche you kind of fall into, right, with photography. Oh, there's a lot of similarities between stylistic things that people do, right? Everybody and their aunt has presets, right? So if you look here on the left side of mine, like these are some presets that I had bought in the past, right? And then obviously there's some natural the built-in presets here. So with this style thing, I this is why I like to teach you guys how to edit first. I think with editing, it is once you understand the foundation of it and learn how to apply it, that's where you can really develop your own style. I would prefer that you do that first so that, you can learn how to edit and figure out, what you like creatively and then put it to your work. And then when you get to a point where you might get a little stuck or you might feeling like you're plateaued, I think at that point would be a good opportunity for you to, or would be a good time for you to buy a preset and maybe try to learn from somebody else's settings, right? Because there's a big difference between presets and filters, right? If you guys use your phone, like if you do portrait mode, right, on your phone, you can go to the different lighting, right? And those are essentially filters. Now, a filter, when you put it onto your photo, you can't change the specific editing sliders on there, right? So you're kind of stuck with that look. And you can edit on top of it, but it might not come out nicely, because you're editing on something that's essentially already edited. Whereas with a preset, I click here, all of my, standard predicate, see how, all these things populated, right? And then instead of having to do what I'm about to do, like, individually, I can change certain things to match what I would want anyway, just because this is my style, I know what I'm looking for, and it speeds up the process a lot, right? But this has come with time, and this has come from, obviously hours and months of editing, right? But once you have a good technical foundation to understand how they all works, I think that's when you have a lot of room to grow in terms of editing. So Yeah, like you'll be able to figure out your style the more you go with it. You can learn from other people because like a lot of people kind of do the same thing, especially in the wedding industry. You got a lot of the filmy type people, where it's like, oh my gosh, a lot of film grain, you know what I mean? It's like super soft, and I'm just doing this like, right? Whatever you get in there, it's like this, right? And this is all cool and fine and dandy, and this has been like a norm in the wedding industry for a long time, which always makes me laugh because we spend thousands of dollars on our equipment just to make it look old, right? I find that there is a little bit of irony in that. Like, but okay, I don't want to get carried away with the point. I hope that answered your question, right? Okay, going back to this, guys. So we did our color temperature first, right? We got our color temperature set to where we're going to start from. And now from here, this is where I'm going to go through my global edits right here on this right side, guys. So if you are in Lightroom Mobile, it'll be under the light tab. And these should be the first things that you see. Okay. Now, honestly, what I do is I just go from top to bottom, right? I already did one step. I already raised my exposure so I can see what's going on in my image, right? Because if I reset it, I double tap this, it resets. This is what my original image looked like. Now, for some people, they'd be like, oh, this image is too dark. I can't do anything with it. This image sucks. Boo-hoo. I've done that so many times in my life, right? But just by raising the exposure, I can already see the detail that I do have, which is pretty good amount of detail, right? Her eyes are closed. I might not necessarily use this photo, but I'm just gonna, edit it as an example, right? So looking at this image, the first thing that stands out to me is my highlights. So I have what's turned on clipping. So you see these red lines here, red spots. What that means is that it's so bright in those spots that when I export this image, or if I was to print this image, then in those red areas would be no detail except for the color white, right? No detail except for the color white. There are ways to turn on your clipping for in Lightroom Mobile. Let's focus on editing first. All this, that's a little bit more granular things, so I think that's something that you can get into more. Do you give, oh, it's okay. Do you give people your raws? Question. No, not unless I am going to charge them a lot. Um, to go on that question real quick. So guys, have you ever been to a sushi restaurant and the sushi chef just gives you the whole fish? Like he doesn't cut it. He just gives you the fish and says, "Okay, here's your food." Has that ever happened?
No.
No, right? And I'm not trying to be like rude or a smart ass. It's just like if you think about, your job as a photographer, right? When people ask you to give them your raws, and if you're a professional established photographer, you're essentially giving out your unfinished work. And you can do that if you want. I personally recommend charging them a lot of extra money to give them the raws because, it's still your work, it's still your photos, and you still technically have the rights to them because, they're your creative property. So you can do with them as you like, but if it kind of diminishes your work too because you're giving it to somebody else to do what they want with it as they see fit, which is fine to me as long as they pay for it. Right? Like, for reference, I charge what, like maybe like $600 for an hour. If somebody were to ask me for the raws for that day, I would charge them at least another $1,000, $750, double whatever the shoot is, because okay, you can have the work, but if you're gonna do something with it, then I want to be compensated with it regardless, right? So I think that's a lot of people's take on the whole Ross thing, but I personally wouldn't do it very, very often, even with charging people. Okay, sorry, I got a little carried away with that. Going here, guys. So first things first, I see my highlights. We're gonna take down the highlights, right? So I go to my highlight tab and I slowly bring that down, and you should see a lot more detail popping up over here, right? So let's reset that. That's before, and that's after, right? Before, after. So we get a little bit more details in there. It's not as bright, right? And we can see our people a little bit better. Now I'm going to go in here. Next thing I would typically do is I'd raise or drop the shadow detail. So we could raise the shadows. So when you're raising the shadows, guys, you're revealing your midtones, right? And this is what I mean by like when you're revealing detail, you're taking away contrast, right? So let's go back, right? So this is what I'm starting at. I just removed my highlights. I get a lot more detail in the sky and the distance, but because of my aperture, it's not going to be completely in focus, right? We look here. it's a little dark here and there. So if we reveal the shadows up a little bit, right, you're gonna see, okay, we get a lot more detail in those areas, but they're not gonna be as much, they're not gonna have as much detail or contrast in it from doing that, you know? So this is what we got to pay attention to while editing, okay? So, I mean, looking at this picture objectively, like it's not a horrible contrast from what it is. So if you want more of a contrasty photo, that's when you can add that stuff in necessarily, you know? See where I'm going with this? It's like, okay, I am trying to think about what I need versus just, okay, automatically doing these things and okay, just doing that. Because if you automatically go through without thinking about what you need next, when you have to go back and fix something, it might not necessarily make sense, right? So going off of this image, I took the highlights down, I revealed the shadows a little bit, right? Now you have your whites and your blacks, right? So your white and your black, the slider, what it means is that's the intensity of your color white and the intensity of your color black, right? So if we look here, look at this part, you see there's a little bit of it's super small. There's a small gap there. So technically you want to have the corners touch for your histogram. So looking at that, that means that there's not enough black saturation in my image, so it's a really light contrast. So I'll just take the blacks down a smidge, and you see how it's touching now, right? And you see how this is a small point, right? So when you have points, right? And you see how this is like a valley, like it's smooth. Points are going to be like a sharper contrast. A valley, or like a small hill is going to be a softer contrast. Because watch if I take the blacks all the way down, right? You see this, obviously, like I'm going to turn the clipping off, but like it looks black hypothetically. But if I don't have my black clipping on, then I don't realize that I am overly saturating the color black in my image, right? So if you look here, it's like all the information is smashed against the left. It's not sharp contrast, but you can tell it's being forced too much into the left. Whereas now if I scooch it over, you can see I get a sharper contrast, right? But it's not as much, right? And now if I go right about there, cool. So it's touching the wall on the left side. I have a small peak. I like contrast, guys. So my work tends to be a little bit more on the contrast side. And now I've added in that detail to the blacks, so the blacks are a little bit more saturated. And now this is a decent starting point for my image, how I feel, right? So because this area in the back is still is white and bright, same here, look here. What you could do too, because if you look here, the highlights are still peaking, but I'm at -93, so it's like hypothetically, there's only so much I can take down if I just do the highlights. But if you take down the whites as well, see how it's spreading that information out, right? It's spreading it to the left so that the brighter parts of the white isn't so intense, so that it's easier to look at my image, and we're still getting a lot of that other detail without that color white overtaking my image. Now we look here, you see there's that little gap again, right? So okay, there's that little gap. That means I took away a lot of like the natural brightness or pop to my image, right? So it might be a little flat. So let's maybe put some highlights back in instead of going to -93. And you see how it kind of pushed that information back. So there's a little gap there, but looking at my image, because like the background was super bright anyway, I'm okay with it having that little gap and not technically touching like the wall, like I just said, right? Remember, this is why it's super relative with the histogram. So that to me, I know, okay, so because I have a super bright sky anyway, my highlights and my whites are going to be peaking more than likely, right? But this information, this is pretty smooth over, right? Looking at this visually, I can see my people fine, my shadow detail is good, right? And then I feel good about where this is at. Okay, so this would be like my global edits that I do to my image first, right? And I would leave this there for right now, right? I didn't do any contrast. I didn't really do much with color, right? That's stuff that I'm going to do next, right? So we did our global edits first. Well, sorry, cull, crop, color temperature, and then global edits, right? I have a presentation that I'm gonna post inside the Google Classroom, guys, that walks through this. Not exactly verbatim how I'm going about it, I find that this is just a lot better way for me to teach you rather than just going through a presentation the whole time. So, but of course, just like always, guys, please ask questions if you have anything while I'm going over it. Okay, so we did going back to this, we did our global edits. The next step for me here would be contrast, right? So looking at our image, I already have a decent amount of contrast in here. Using my camera that I have, it's obviously it's a higher end camera, so I might not necessarily need to add contrast at all points. You know, but just to kind of give you an example. So if you are in the light tab in Lightroom Mobile, towards the top, right above where it says exposure, and to the right, you should see a little tab that's called curve. So it'll look like this. This is what's called your curve tool, right? There is what looks like an S over here. It's still your curve tool, but it has it broken up to where instead of touching the curve tool itself, you can change these sliders instead, which kind of makes it easier to a certain degree, but personally, I think this is what works a lot better. The curve tool, guys, this is as needed, right? Because if I don't have any points on here, look what I can do to my image, right? As I move this line around, I'm pushing contrast all over the different parts of my image. And right now it's just kind of haywire and it's going crazy, right? That's not what we want, right? So with the curve tool, right? If just like the histogram, see, this is how this thing is going to keep recurring. This is our blocks. I'm touching that point, making a dot there. That's our shadows. In the middle is our midtones. Up here's our highlights, and then you have our whites, right? So just like the histogram, this is built in the same way from left to right, except, it's more of a diagonal, right? So traditionally with the curve tool, most people do what's called an S curve, right? So it's called an S curve, but it doesn't need to look like a genuine S, because if we made it look like an actual S, well, you get this mess. This is gross, right? This is not what we want. So, but do you see from having this middle point, do you see how it's keeping the lines from going wherever it wants? That is what's important, right? Because those points are going to help you really control where you're putting contrast into your image, right? So if I grab just down here, this is at our shadows, right? If I bring it down a little bit, let me just zoom in. Hold on, let's go back. Right, so let's pay attention to right here. If I bring that down, you can see I'm adding contrast into the shadow parts of my image, and they're getting much more saturated, much more contrast, right? So this is the full image before, and this is the full image after, right? And you notice how I don't have any clipping here, right? I don't have anything that's like too dark. So this is just at a perfect spot. I mean, this is pretty dark for what it is. This might be darker than I'd want personally, just to kind of show as an example. So I bring that down, right? My shadows down a little bit. And then I go up to my highlights. And, I did bring some of them down. Now there's a lot more contrast in here. If I just bring them up and bring back some of that pop into my image, right? Well, then it's going to raise the highlights and make them brighter. Yeah. Now we look at this image, right? And this is pretty contrasty. So this is before, and then this is what we did after, right? Can you see the amount of extra contrast and detail in the shadows, and a little bit of extra pop here, right? So that's a very standard way of doing contrast, right? And then when you add contrast, guys, there's a good chance you might have to kind of move things around to balance it out. So for me, I made this like the black's very deep. That feels like a little bit too much for me. So I'm actually going to go back into my global edits. I'm going to raise the shadows a bit more. And so instead of it being super dark, right, well, we still get that nice contrast to it. Now it's not as deep of a black, right? If anything, maybe I just want to bring the exposure down again because now it's super bright, right? So now you see that I'm adding contrast. I'm going back and fixing the things that, because I'm adding contrast to my image, I'm trying to balance it out, right? Now, if you just wanted to use the contrast slider, because if you notice, I didn't touch it at all. That's okay. It'll work, right? So I'm going to move it up. You're going to see I'm punching contrast into my image, right? This will work, right? But contrast, especially in this area, is part of your global edits, right? Meaning it affects the whole image. Now, if you think your whole image needs contrast, this is an easy way to do it, just using the contrast slider, right? But do you see when I get to a point, you see how I'm getting some clipping there, right? And you see how this is all, it's like really pointy right there. You're going to add detail back into your image, right? But it's not as controlled. Whereas if I just did a simple 1, 2, 3 on my curve tool, let's reset that. I bring this down a little bit, bring that up a little bit, small S curve. Now I've added contrast into my image. See how subtle my movements were with the curve tool. And I feel pretty good about this. I look at this image, okay, I think the contrast here is good, especially with the things I balanced out. It's a little bit more defined, but I don't feel like it's, too sharp of a contrast. I'm like, okay, cool. I feel good about this, right? That's as simple as your contrast can be, right? Because if you do your global edits in a way to where you reveal the information that you need, right? And then you put in contrast, you're going to have an easier time balancing your image. If you try to do contrast first and then balance out your image, well, you're going to have a harder time trying to get to a better balance because contrast affects everything, right? Contrast affects color, shadows, midtones, all of that. And instead of putting contrast in the whole image, right, we want to put it to where we need it, right? And that's how we do it with the curve tool, right? Does anybody have any questions about the curve tool? Thumbs up. We're all
Yo,
good?
I mean,
Yes.
I don't have a question. It's not regarding the curve tool, but I was just wondering if you have like I'm seeing your images at the bottom. If
Mhm.
you have so many images you have to edit, how do you keep like a consistent like style between them? Because some of them like this one image has like a bright sky
Mhm.
on the background, but some others don't have that. So how do you keep that balance between all
Mm.
of the pictures you have to edit?
Okay, good question. Good question. So because I work with natural light, um, you can make things balance color-wise for the most part. If you are using, do I have any in here? No. So when you're using natural light, you have to be a lot more aware of the sun, the color that's coming through, all this different stuff. And then you have to learn how to balance them out from photo to photo. That's why color temperature, white balance is super important because if you get those together, right, hypothetically, it should be easy to make it look the same, right? And I'm saying hypothetically, and I'm laughing because especially so living here in Hawaii, right? We're so much closer to the equator. Our sun is so much more intense. So that as it goes down and as it comes through clouds and as it interacts with something, that changes the color a little bit. So figuring out how to balance image by image as the sun is changing takes time and effort. And honestly, if you learn how to control the color temperature, like slider itself, it's relatively easy. It's not 100% precise, but it will be, it'll get you as close as possible, right? So for example, right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to I'm going to copy this, copy the settings from this, right? And I'm going to go to a much later image here, right? And this should probably be something different. I'm going to reset this. And now I'm going to paste the stuff here, right? And then raise that. Okay. So this is that image. Went from there. And where's the other one? Oh man, I went further back. I should have done it like this. Sorry, let me find that image. Nah, it doesn't really matter, right? So go back to, here's my other image. Paste it here. So you see from just copy and pasting my settings, right? Like this color is roughly close to this color, right? And as I copy it, it's because I'm copying the white balance, all of these other different settings, right? Instead of trying to think exactly like, okay, this needs exactly this needs exactly that. If you copy and paste your settings from image to image, it should make it a lot easier to do so. And then worst case, like let's say, this image was a little bit cooler from the images from the settings that I just copy and pasted. Well, okay, instead of changing the whole thing, I'm going to change the color temperature. And you see as I move that around, that's going to establish the base white balance to make it look similar between images. Does that make sense? Is anybody confused by what I just said? Anybody? Yeah, so this is why your presets and copy and pasting your settings is going to be so huge for you, because it's going to save you time. It's going to make things much faster, and ideally it's going to make it a lot more fun, right? So after I get through all this, I'm going to teach you guys how to make your preset. Surprise, it's super easy. It's not complicated. And then you'll be able to fly, ideally copy one setting and go to the next, use your preset from one to the next, and change these small sliders to balance them out without having to do a lot of the heavy lifting of editing each image to be the same, right? I have to catch myself, because in order for me to balance out my images, there's a lot more that I do to make them look natural, ironically, right? Through editing versus okay, leaving it as it was shot and going with just that, right? So good question though. Good question. I'll just keep working on this photo. Actually, I like this photo. Okay, so go along with this photo, right? This is what's called focus contrast. Some people might like it. I actually do this one instead. They're focused. Yeah, we'll do this one. There we go. We'll work on this image instead. Right, do you see? But just from that alone, the difference of just copy. So I went from here, copied, right? This is what the standard image was. I pasted, right? And then I raised just the exposure, and now it's pretty close. Right, that's super fast, super straightforward. And albeit, yes, I'm editing on my computer, so things are gonna be a lot faster anyway. But these things that you can do to speed up your editing is going to really help. Okay, so where was I? I went through color temperature, global edits, contrast, right? Contrast using the curve tool, right? This is my base image for right now. The next thing I'm going to go into, guys, to me which is the most fun, is going to be color, right? So inside Lightroom Mobile, next to on the bottom where there's the light tab, there's another tab that says color, right? In there is where you're also going to find color temperature. You're going to find vibrance and saturation. I'm not going to go over them just yet. I'm actually going to go over them after, because vibrance and saturation, they're global edits, and I want to control specific colors before I want to control all the colors together. Does that make sense? So the way that we can control the specific colors, right, is if we go to something called the color mixer. So just like how curve, that tool, that box is right above exposure under the light tab, if you go to the color tab and above where it says color temperature to the right, it'll be in the middle of your phone, right? You should see something that says color mix. It should look like a little rainbow wheel. When you go there, you see all the colors of the rainbow. Woo! Right? So guys, you've probably heard of something called color theory. If you ever want to see what good color theory is, I recommend watching the show Queen's Gambit. That show has some of the best color theory I've ever seen. And that'll give you an idea of how, working with color can do so much for your imagery. Am I expecting you guys to be color theory experts? Absolutely not. Am I a color theory expert? I'm okay, right? That's something that I could spend a whole other couple of weeks on, and I'd be learning a lot of it as we go along too, because there's just so much that revolves around color. I want to teach you the easiest way to control color without having to think about it. I want it to be simple, right? Because color is a lot of fun, but it can get very complicated very fast if you don't know what you're doing and you're just trying a whole bunch of things, right? Getting back to my point. So looking at the color mixer, you should see 3 different options, right? You see hue, saturation, and luminance. Going in order, so hue is the shade of color, right? Like pink is a shade of red, indigo is a shade of blue, so on and so forth. So looking at this image, right, I'm just going to highlight on the yellow and the green. So if I change the hue of the yellow to make it green, look what happens. It's more green. If I change the yellow to be a little bit more orange, well, what happens? It becomes a little bit more orange. Now look at the whole image as I check these. right? Let's make it the greens a little bit more green. Now that's super vibrant, right? But it's more of a traditional green, right? And notice how I'm affecting the color yellow, right? So a lot of what we believe with like the color green in nature actually picks up as the color yellow, right? So I can do the same thing with hue for green, but you notice how it doesn't affect the whole image as much, right? So just the specific parts of it, right? But like you just from changing the hue of one color can do quite a bit for your image, right? Now, I don't necessarily change hue a lot. The reason being is because, well, if you change the hue of a specific color, then your other colors are going to kind of register differently. So this is where being on top of your color theory and understanding how it works a little bit more is helpful. There are easier ways to change the colors and whatnot, to make them balance, I think. So I don't necessarily do hue very often. It's, it is there, play around with it, try it. I'm not saying don't use it, right? I just thinking if we're going to get into something like color grading, which I'm going to show you here in a little bit, there are other ways that you can manipulate the color that are going to work a little bit better together. That makes it a little bit easier, if that makes sense. Okay. So that's hue. Now, saturation, we should all be familiar with the word saturation. That's the intensity of the color. Looking at here, if I just grab the color yellow and I make the yellow color yellow plus 100, well, look how vibrant and overly saturated that color is, right? Before, oops, after, right? Let's do the color green. See how the color green, it's not as or deep in there as you would think, right? That's something to pay attention to with colors. Each color has a complementary color. And if you're not sure which is the complementary color, well, guess what? They're right next to each other. So it makes it easy. Reds complements orange, yellows complements green, aqua, blue, purple, and magenta, right? So look, right? Sweet. That's saturation. The last one is luminance. And if you're familiar with the word luminance, that should give it away directly what it does. It's raising or dropping the brightness of your colors, right? So going along with yellow and green, since we have it here, if I just raise the luminance of the yellow, hold on, let's get in there, right? So this is what it looks like before. If I raise the luminance of the yellow, look how much brighter the color yellow is, right? So that could be one way to bring up some colors in your image to make them stand out a little bit more, right? So I did that with the yellow here. Let's drop that. You're going to see it fall to the background, right? So let's do the color orange, and you should, oh, hold on, let's zoom in. So looking at our skin tones here, if I was to raise the luminance of the color orange, you should see their skin tones brighten up a little bit, right? Now, because I have, so let's reset that, right? So let me actually take this down. Let's say this is the image I want. It's like, okay, right? You got some light on her face, so, but you can tell there's not as much natural highlights because I took them down. If I was to raise the orange luminance a little bit more, can you tell, okay, before, after? Now you have more of that natural brightness to their face, which in an image like this pulls your attention towards their face because it's standing out now more. So you see just from just from controlling the luminance, right? Before, after, right? How much that brightness change for just that specific color is going to dictate where your eyes go into your image. If you guys want a simple trick to figure out where your viewer is looking for your photo, look away from your photo real quick and then look back. And then think about the first place your eye goes to, right? If your eye goes to your main subject, awesome, right? You did it. You made your viewer look at what you wanted them to look at. And that you should feel good about that, right? Because we want our viewer to look at what we're telling them to, for the most part, right? So doing stuff like this is going to help really dictate where your viewer goes so that they can get the point of your image. The point is that this is a cute young couple and they're getting married. Good for them. They're super sweet, right? Not to take away from their wedding or anything, right? But he's putting the ring on her finger. My attention goes to her face because you got that nice strong light there, right? The colors and everything else kind of balance, whatever, right? Sweet. That means like my image has something to it, right? Now, with the color mixer tool, this is where I have a lot of the most fun because it is where I get to control all these different parts of my image, right? So for me, let's see. Okay, I'm gonna raise the brightness a little bit more so I can see my image. Looking at this, right? The color that stands out to me the most here is the color blue. Can anybody tell me where the color blue is standing out to me?
It could be in the sky, in the white.
Yes, yes, in the white, right? Because when I zoom in, you see the color cast of the blue here. To me, that's distracting, right? Because to me, it takes away from like what its color it's supposed to be, right? So there's a blue, there's a color, the color blue is bleeding onto their shirts, right? Their clothes. So I want the blue to be less saturated. So what do? Is I take the blue saturation down. And by removing all of that blue, do you feel how much more natural this image looks now? Do you look at this image, you feel like, okay, like you're not really, it just, to me, it feels a lot more genuine of how it looked in the actual moment, right? So this is before the blue. Look at how it's not like looking at this from here, right? You're like, it's not really a crazy lot of blue. It's super subtle, and some people might even miss it. But for me, it stands out a lot. And then I take that blue down. Now it looks more white. Now it looks more natural. There's still some blue in the sky and in the background, just enough for you to know that it's a faded, you know, color palette in the sky. And now my image feels way more natural to me, right? Can you guys see that? Yeah? Okay, so here I also think that the yellow and the green is a little strong. So let's try taking the green saturation down, the yellow saturation down, right? Kind of balance that out a little bit. So I do like, I think I'm gonna bring up the skin tone a little bit, right? So skin tones, guys, are gonna register from orange and red and yellow typically. For here, it's gonna be orange and red. So let's bring up the saturation a little bit, right? So before, after, and it's subtle. It's just a little bit. I'm gonna do the same thing with red, right? Kind of bring their skin tones back, right? And now this is my image here. So this is what my image started from, the raw image that I took in camera. And this is where I ended up. Raw image, where I am now, right? Oh, got something in the chat. Do you work with masking before doing the global edits? No, I don't. So masking, guys, I'm going to show you how to do it. If you pay for the program for either your phone or through your computer, you're going to have the option to do masking. I personally would rather you guys learn how to edit properly and then go into masking. Because if you were to mask the sky, mask the people, edit those first, and you don't have a good grasp of editing, well, you're going to be able to see your edits, right? Like my thing about editing is like I shouldn't be able to see what you did. Is how I feel. I'm a purist. I'm a traditionalist. I like, my old school photos. I like it feeling like a photo, right? Not feeling like a digitally manipulated thing that has all this stuff standing out now because I manipulated it to be that way. Does that make sense? Right? I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with masking. I say like there's things with masking that is super helpful, right? But instead of just going straight to masking, I would rather you do this. So I'm going to skip to, well, first off, guys, before I go to this next part, does everybody understand the color mixer tool? Does anybody have any questions about that? We're all good. I see, yep, bunch of nods, right? Thumbs up. Cool. We're all good. Love that. Love the SpongeBob background. That gets me every time. Right. Okay. So going on to what you said about masking, right? Masking is super helpful. That is ways you can do a lot more. This is going to be a little bit of a cheat that you can do to all your images, guys. That's going to give you a little bit of that masking look without having it be overdone. And it's super simple. I'm laughing because it's like, this is so much easier and so much more reliable for you to do in the beginning. So if you guys in the tabs underneath, you should see where it says effects. And under effects, you should see where it says vignette, right? So vignette, if you're familiar with it, if anybody's ever seen those like old J.C. Penney, like portraits, the studio portraits, like the mom and the son, all that stuff, right? Typically what you might see is something like this, where it has a really, really strong white or really strong black border around it, right? So this is like your traditional vignettes where it has, but what essentially it does is it either makes a brighter circle around your image or makes a darker circle around your image. Now, would I do negative 100 or plus 100 of each? Absolutely not. What I normally do is I do like negative 10, negative like 11, negative 15, give or take. So what you should see is it's darker on the edges of our image, right? So let's go before and then after, right? Before, after. Now, what this does, right, is it makes a darker border around your image. And because the outside of your image is a little bit darker, it's going to naturally push your viewer's focus towards the center of the image, right? So to me, this is the easiest form, because masking, it basically, well, if you want to go old school, right? The point of masking was to do something called dodge and burning, which is basically you are adding an exposure or making parts of your image darker to emphasize focus on your subject, right? So I think doing a little bit of a dark vignette is just a good, it's an easy stylistic thing that you can do to your images that make them feel a little bit more cinematic or a little bit more natural, right? Just because a lot, especially with my camera, right? My camera, I have 61 megapixels. That's 61 million pixels. And I'm not saying that to brag and be like, oh, good for me, right? The point is that when I shoot, if I shoot with my full resolution, my camera, my images feel like way too real. You ever looked at an image, you're like, man, that feels like I can almost touch that person. So there's things like this that we can do to help make it feel like more of a natural image, or it just kind of gives a little bit more of a nicer feel and aesthetic. Because, going old school, like all lenses typically have a natural vignette, right? They have what's called profile corrections. We are going to go over that here a little bit later. And they correct that natural vignette so that you have, an undistorted image. Let me see if I can just do that here. Go into that much. But yeah, does that get my point across though? Right? Does everybody understand what I mean by that? Okay, cool. I will go over masking towards the end to show you that specifically, but right now let's focus on like the more basic stuff so that it makes way more sense when you get to that point. Okay. So recapping everything we've done, right? We cropped, we sorted our photos, we cropped, we did color temperature, we did global edits, we did our curve tool, and then we went into color, right? So by color, we did our color mix tool, right? We did these few changes to the things that we want. Oh, let me actually, cool. And there's our image. Cool. Woo! We got that point. Awesome. Right? So the next things I'm about to show you are more stylistic things, right? That you can add to your image if you want to, kind of add a little bit more elements to it. But this is more or less how I would edit the core of my image, right? And let's say that I did all my other stylistic things, from here, I would create a preset, right? Is the best photo ever. You can use, my name for a preset if you want. Totally fine, not offended. You can, right? And you just go to your next image, right? And we click the preset, right? Cool, awesome. Go to the next image, click the preset, right? Okay, hey, this is a little bit bright. Let's take the exposure down a little bit, right? Okay, maybe it's a little contrasty here. I can either take some contrast out or maybe I'll just reveal more shadow detail, bring this back down. Okay, cool. All right, and then I'm on to the next image. Do you see how fast that is? Do you see how, because I have my first photo edited to the way that I see it in my mind, you can make that preset, you can copy the settings from it, either or, right? Whatever works better for you and just works a little bit faster, right? And then you're going to be able to go through your images ideally rather quickly instead of having to redo start from to finish what I did on this photo. Because if you did that for every single photo, it's, you're just adding a lot more work for yourself, right? So going on with this image, right? So we did all that. Now we're going to go into some stylistic things, right? So if you go back under the effects tab, it should be under effects. Hold on, I got to check to see where this is because I always forget. I want to make sure I'm looking at the right thing. Lightroom. Okay. Yes. So on the bottom, it should say effects, right? So we did vignette. We understand what vignette is. I already explained that. So if we go under effects, you should see these three options right here: texture, clarity, and dehaze, right? So texture, guys, texture is self-explanatory. And when you raise it, it's going to add texture to your image, right? So this is what is before, right? And then I raise that up and you can see that the texture of the trees, it's a lot more defined. This is great for, you know, like wildlife or landscape, things that you want a lot more texture and detail. Now, did the texture help my bride out? No, not at all. She saw this, she would hate me. I wouldn't have a job. She'd be like, what the hell did you do to me? Excuse my language, right? So texture, guys, is very situational and depending on who and what you're working with. Working with people, especially for women, right? I don't do a lot of texture. Guys, you know, we can stand a little bit of extra texture, right? Because it kind of makes us look a little bit more masculine, a little bit more rugged, which can help us in a sense, right? But not so much for women. You know what I mean? Like that's just, I think it's a good rule of thumb to follow. Paying attention to who's you're editing on, right? For me as a safety parameter, honestly, for all of my portraits, I just do like -10. I do negative texture because it just smooths out the skin a little bit, right? And just makes it a little bit look a little bit softer. And that's just something I do. Right. The next thing here, clarity. So clarity is similar to contrast, right? So if I was to raise the contrast tool, look at all that. A lot of contrast, ooh, too much. Don't do that, right? So if I raise clarity, instead of adding contrast to my whole image, what clarity does is it adds contrast to the lines within my image. To the lines within my image, right? Look at this image. This is 58 clarity. Once again, that's kind of gross. We don't like that, right? If I was to go to, I was just in Texas teaching that destination class. So if I go to, where is it? Okay, here, this image, right? So if I go into this image and I raise the clarity, look at how much more defined the building gets, right? This is before and this is after, right? It's kind of obviously that's kind of a lot, especially with the people. When you can see this kind of gray cast to your image, right? To me, that means that you have too much contrast in your image, right? So this is clarity. It affects just the lines of your in your image. If I raise the contrast, right, you see how it works. It like adds contrast and detail to it, but it's definitely not the same as adding a bunch of clarity. Yeah. So if you ever seen like those old school photos where they're like, oh, drama, the drama filter, where everything looks like this and it's really sharply defined, that's essentially someone doing like plus 100 clarity and being like, yeah, this is cool, right? To each their own. Personally wouldn't do plus or minus 100 of very many things except for highlights and shadows. I just want to point that out because once again, it's very situational on what you're going to be working or what you're going to be putting it on, right? So going back to, where was that? That was Ashley and Bryce. Okay, let me just pick. Let's do this one. Right, okay, we're going here. We're going to go back to, just place the settings there, right? And see, like, I just pasted the settings that I had from earlier, and look how my image is already here, right? So you can tell this image is a little bit cooler than what my settings were before, right? So all I would do is just make it a little bit warmer. You see how the skin tone pops out? It looks a little bit closer to what the other image looked like color-wise. And the only thing I did was just raise the color temperature, right? So that's why like setting your color temperature in the beginning is super important because it's going to help. It's your foundation for the rest of your colors for the most part, right? So going back to here, going back into, sorry, we're going back to effects, right? We went over texture, we went over clarity, dehaze. Now, dehaze, if you just think about the name, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's getting rid of the haze in your image, right? So let's say if this was a hazy image, if I was to pump in dehaze, it's going to forcefully put in detail into our image, kind of like contrast in a sense. and it will hypothetically remove that haze. But if you can tell, right, I only did 28, but my it's getting way too sharp, the contrast. It's getting way too like over too much detail, right? So dehaze, just like everything else, guys, it's a little bit more of a subtle thing. I normally don't use it, right? Or maybe I might add like +5, +10, just a little bit, but it's not something that like I overly add into my images, if that makes sense, right? So, okay, that's effects that we went over vignette, right? The other thing about under effects, right, you have what's called grain. Now, going back to what I talked about earlier about that film style, guys. So there's a difference between digital noise and grain and film grain. Digital noise is an imperfection in your image from your camera not having enough light to capture the image, right? Whereas film grain, right here, you got to in order to really see it, you have to zoom in quite a bit, right? Cute couple. Now, there's no film grain here. If you look here, these like kind of little dots and marks on their face, that's what's called noise, technically, right? It's not enough. I mean, like nobody's really going to zoom in this far typically, so I'm not worried about that noise. But if we add in the grain, you should start to see this graininess to my image, right? Can you guys see that? So this is before, this is after. And do you see how you have a lot more of those like dots and everything all around the image, right? So this is before without the grain, and this is after without the grain, which from this distance you can't really tell, right? But when we zoom in, then we can tell what the grain is doing. Now, what you need to realize about grain too is that, not only are you adding that kind of that effect to your image, what it does too is it actually flattens your image, right? Because you're forcefully inserting these little bits of information into your image, and it kind of removes some of the depth and dimension of your work, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Once again, this is a stylistic thing. If you like that, that's something that you can do. I used to do it religiously because, as a wedding photographer, a lot of people use film grain in their work. And I thought that's something that I needed to do as well. I've gotten away from that just because I like the depth and dimension that I do in my work now, right? But you can see that's just like a style thing, and it's a style thing that a lot of people were doing. And that's something that I was doing myself. But, up to you if that's what you want to include, right? Okay, so there's effects. And then the last one is going to be detail. So guys, I from what I'm about to say, I cannot stress this enough. Please do not add sharpening to your photos. Please. You don't need to. I have never encountered a situation where I needed to add sharpening to my image. And I cannot think of any situation where you guys are going to have to do the same because it's here. People think we need to use it. Oh yeah, I want my images to be sharp. And now if I go to +149 sharpness from right here, you can't really see what it did. Let me zoom in, right? Look at this. Look at all these little things on their face. That's sharpness. Do we want that? Probably not, right? This is what the base parameter is. This is before I added any sharpness. We're going to go up. And what you notice, that is way too much. Please, 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 just don't use it. Just don't do it. You don't have to, right? You can forget about it. Awesome. Like, seriously, I do not.
Like another texture.
What was that? It's kind of, right? Texture, it does work similar in a sense, like because of like how it looks when you zoom in, but it isn't entirely the same. It is something that I've personally never figured out how to use effectively. That doesn't mean that you like if you want to, you can go ahead. I just think in terms of all the other stuff that we have available, it's not necessary. Save yourself the work and an extra step. Like there's a way when you export your images where it'll say sharpen for screen. I would rather you do that and let it figure it out for you than trying to guess what is a proper sharpening added to it. Does that make sense? Everybody understand? Right? Sorry, if you guys want to do otherwise, you're your own people. Don't let me stop you. Right? It's just I don't really see the point or the need for it, right? And then after detail, okay, the last thing, guys, is going to be where it says optics, right? So where is that here? Lens corrections. So like I was saying earlier about all lenses having a natural vignette, having some sort of natural distortion to them, right? So this is my image right now. This is without my profile corrections. I'm going to turn it on. Did you see how quick it kind of like zoomed in a little bit, right? So this is before and this is after, right? So what this is Tamron. So if you look here, right, if you do this on Lightroom Mobile, you're not going to see the actual corrections like I can see here inside my computer, right? But when I enable the profile corrections, it automatically detects what my lens I was using, who the maker is, and then they have an online profile that they provide that will correct the natural distortion or vignetting that comes from my lens. Now, for you guys, if you're using Lightroom Mobile, you turn it on, you will probably see a small effect, right? I think it's good to have on, especially if you're using, shooting with your phone camera, because there is some natural distortion, especially at like the 25 or 24 millimeter lens. Like anything less than 35 millimeter is going to have some sort of distortion, right? It's called a barrel distortion, meaning everything looks really big. Is if anybody's ever done the 0.5 and try to take a picture of their friend and been like right up in their face and be like, oh my God, this looks awful. Everything looks huge. That's because of that barrel distortion, right? So this is a way to kind of deal with that distortion to a certain degree. I think it's good to turn on, but if it changes your style, how it looks overall, like for me, I did some editing. Yeah, I didn't have it on anyway, so I'm okay without it. I like the way this looks without it, so I'm gonna keep it as is, right? So once again, it's kind of a situational thing, right? And then there's also what's called chromatic aberration. There's a little tab for it. So chromatic aberration, you're probably not going to see it as much nowadays, but essentially it's like if you take an image and there's a part of your image that's way too bright, you get these little imperfections, like these little color imperfections that tend to be like magenta or green. Removing chromatic aberration would be technically removing that. But it only works so well. It's once again situational. If you click it and you can notice the difference, awesome. If not, it's something you could probably skip from adding on. Yeah. So okay. All right, so that is the majority of what I do for editing. The next few things I'm going to go over are like the little extra bits of style things. That's going to be masking, and then I'm going to start with color grading first. All this stuff, everything after, that's just the last finishing pieces that I add that really make my photo the way that I want it to be personally. For reference, I don't do masking very often. I don't feel the need to most times, just because with using the vignette tool the way that I do for my portraits, it just tends to be a little bit even easier and faster process, right? But before we even do that, color grading, right? Color grading. You've probably heard this word thrown around, guys. And once again, going back to color theory, you should know all these things, yada, yada, yada. So I'm going to teach you the easiest way to color grade your images with barely any thought, right? And you just need to remember this phrase: spin to win. Sorry guys, I like my little sayings because they're super cheesy, but they really ingrain certain ideas into my mind so that I don't forget them, right? So when you open up, so if you go into color, right, the color tab in Lightroom Mobile, there should be on the top next to color mixer, you should see color grading. And what happens when you open it up, it's going to be on these individual color balls, right? The first one you should get would be shadows, midtones, and then highlights. So 1, 2, and 3. With color grading, guys, the first place you're going to start is your shadows. Start with your shadows first. And just like everything else, guys, it's all about subtlety, right? So you're not going to necessarily be pumping in a huge amount of color, right? Because this is my shadows. I just pumped in a bunch of red into the shadows, and what do I have? A severely red image. Is this what I want? Absolutely not, right? So if you remember, if you double click on the dots, guys, that tends to work a lot just to reset it quicker. So instead, what I do is I'm going to put in a little bit, just a little bit past that circle. Maybe even that's too much, right? And then we are going to spin to win, guys. Spin to win. So instead of thinking about what color goes where and what would balance this out, you are spinning that little ball on the outside. It works the same way in Lightroom Mobile, right? Make sure you're touching just the ball, right? And you're going to spin it around and basically go in a circle. until you find a nice flattering color base for that part that you're trying to add color into. So for this one, it's the shadows. I just pumped in now it ended up on blue. And now I have a much more balanced, like white balance, right? So let's remove that, right? And once again, this is super subtle, right? So this is without, and this is with. It's like almost indistinguishable, right? But for me to balance out my colors and make things look more natural, this is where I go with color grading, because there are certain parts of your image that no matter if you don't do things with color grading, like see over here, like you can only get so much color into certain parts of your image, right? By doing it these other ways until you forcefully input color into the different parts of your image, your shadows, midtones, your highlights, right? Let's redo it. Then you're going to have a lot more color control. This can get complicated really quickly. This is why I'm showing this to you last, because you don't necessarily need to do this, right? So going back to this, I add a little bit of blue into the shadows. I don't do the midtones next. I do the highlights next. Shadows, then highlights, right? So we're just going to add a little bit, right? And now I'm going to spin to win. Where do I like this? Okay, well, I like more blue, or do I want to make it a little bit? Ah, there we go. I like that. I like that warmth, right? So now I'm adding a little bit of like red, orange, right, into the highlights. And now it still feels like a natural image to me. But because we have that little bit of red into the highlights and the brighter parts of our image, right, we have a little bit more of what I feel like is that sunset glow, right? So this is without, and then this is with, right? Super, super subtle. Super, super just like little bit, right? And I could stop here for color grading. I think I could leave that as is. This is why I do midtones last, because, you know, then I think about, okay, do I want to add more color to their skin, whatever the background. So let's just add a little bit of color. Let's see how this looks, right? Okay, if I leave it there, that's a little too orange and red for me. Let's spin it around, right? So maybe right about there. Cool. So now that I pumped a little bit more blue back in there, it kind of balanced out the highlights. So like the skin tone feels a little bit more natural, but we still get a little bit of that rosy sky, right? Let me reset this. Okay, so this is before and this is after, right? This is before. Wait, oh, sorry. This is before. This is after. It's such a minute difference, right? I'm not expecting you guys to be like, oh yeah, I can see it like very well, right? The point is to be subtle, to not be noticeable, to emphasize these colors and make it a little bit more personalized for your style without your viewer being like, oh, hey, that's weird. You know what I mean? The word I live by when it comes to editing is the word seamless. I ideally want my images and my work to be seamless, to where when I look at it, I can look from start to finish and not be mentally taken out of the experience, which is like this couple getting married, right? Okay, so now we're gonna go into masking real quick. So for me, I push M. Where is it? Right there. Okay, cool. So guys, with masking, you know, there's a couple different ways to do it. You can select the subject, the sky, the background, the people. Once again, I'm not really choosing those specific things. I'm actually choosing either what's going to be called a radial gradient or a linear gradient, right? I'm going to do the radial gradient first, right? And when I do it, it's going to make, you know, you see it's kind of a circle, right? You can manipulate the shape as much as you want, right? Everything that's highlighted in red is going to be what is affected by your gradient, right? So if I bring yep, it's there in the center, right? So that might not necessarily be, that's not what I want with the radial tool, right? Not necessarily. For me, I want to invert it, right? So when I invert it, you see now it's the outside of my images, right? Like the outside and whatever's like barely lit up here in the center is going to be not affected, right? And the first thing I always start with masking, guys, is just exposure, right? So just from doing one mask, one radial mask, and just taking down the exposure after I inverted it, to where this part in here is not being affected, but everything else on the outside is getting a darker exposure. Do you feel like your eyes go right towards the center of my image where it's going to my subject? Right? Now, I also have a vignette in this image. So with that, oh no, I don't. Just kidding. Okay. So if I had a vignette on top of this, right, it could be a little bit intense, right? You can really see the dark parts out of here. So this is kind of why like it's kind of one or the other in my mind, right? Without the mask, if I did just the vignette, hold on. So I'm gonna delete this. If I did just the vignette, oh my gosh, come on, computer. Thank you. It'll have a similar effect to a certain degree, right? Like it'll still work. And that's why I think vignetting is pretty sweet because it's easy and quick, right? But with that radial gradient, you know, right? This all over again. You can make it, you can mold it, you can shape it, right? You can rotate it. There's so many things that you can do with it that allow you to shape and mold the image however you want with that light. And you see where I'm going with this? Now it's like, all right, and we're going to zoom back in. All right, let's see. That's without it. And then with it. And it's subtle, right? It's subtle. That is one of the major ways of doing it, like of using the masking tool, right? I like the radial because it's easier for me to really focus emphasis around my subject. A lot of what other people do is what's called a linear gradient, right? So linear gradient, instead of being radial is circle, linear is in a line, right? So instead, what happens is you can make a gradient, layer like that, right? Duplicate it. I have one coming from the other side, and now I have the other coming from the other side, right? So instead of having like, a circle around my subject, right? What happens now is I have two different linear gradients, making it a negative exposure, darker on the outside, getting brighter towards the center. So once again, I'm pushing focus towards the center, right? And that's one way of using that. Now, I like those more because I feel like those work a little bit better personally. Now, let's say if I do the sky here, right? I'll bring the sky down. Do you see how it kind of where it's split on them, right? And that's kind of very noticeable to me, right? And then now, okay, I'm gonna leave that as is. Now I'm gonna select the subject, right? Now it's gonna pick out my people, right? And now I'm gonna raise them brighter, right? Or make it brighter, I gotta kind of move this around to try and balance it out with the background, right? And this works, right? So that's masking like this. You could do it this way with editing, and it will work sometimes to a certain degree. But if you don't know how to blend your images, right? If you don't know how to blend your masks, like, do you see how wonky this gets really fast? And obviously, I'm not really putting any effort into it, right? This isn't me like fully putting in my time and devotion to making this mask work. But like, this is kind of the stuff that I see from a lot of people when they do masks is that, okay, hey, I got this reveal detail here. Okay, cool. I can see them. The background, it doesn't take away the focus. Okay, fine. This is a good photo. This to me isn't a good photo, right? And like, well, the photo itself is fine. The editing to me is awful, right? I would rather you edit the image like yourself and get everything to balance out more because like I'd rather have an image like this where I can still look at them. The sky, yeah, is maybe a little bit bright, but I look at this image and I feel like, okay, this is how it actually looked in the moment. Does that make sense? Right? Do you understand? So can you see why I'm like not really a huge proponent of teaching you guys how to mask, because it's super simple. Like you can use it. And once again, I'm not ever telling you guys not to use it, but like, it's might not be like the best solution for you, right? One of the other things, okay, let me just do some stuff real quick so I can reveal detail, right? All I did was just raise the exposure. Okay, it looked like they were separate items. Yes, that's why I don't like masking if you don't know what you're doing. That is why I don't prefer to teach you it without like, you know, because if you're using Lightroom Mobile, you have to pay for the subscription in order to be able to do it. Like I said, you know, yesterday, if you pay for one less coffee, you can afford it, right? But it's not entirely necessary for the beginning of your photography journey, right? So, okay, guys, we are just about to wrap up. I don't want to take up too much longer. I just want to show you one last thing, guys, and that is removing. Wait, what are you doing? Hold on. Once I can figure my life out with my computer. All right, come on. So guys, I'm going to show you the difference between the different kinds of remove options, right? So what is it? P? Oh, U? There it is. Yeah. So you see how here it says generative AI, right? When you guys are, if you use removal inside Lightroom Mobile, you're going to see that there's this tab to click. If you don't have it turned on, guys, it will still hypothetically work, right? So, oh, sorry. So my guy was there. Oh my gosh. Okay, so this was before, this is after, right? If we zoom in, you can kind of see those little lines there, those little, to me, that stands out, right? I can do it here. These guys are going to disappear too. So using the remove tool without generative AI, you're using the program's ability to run an algorithm to try to cover this stuff up. And it'll work, right? There's ways to blend it to make it work. But with generative AI, it uses your internet connection to remove objects, right? So what happens is you're going to be able to select everything like this. You're going to click remove. All the unicorns in the magical interwebs are going to do their things. They're going to dance. They're going to whatever, throw a party, whatever it might be that they do in the magical inner world, inner space, whatever you want to call it. Sorry, I'm not that funny. And boom, look, it got rid of it pretty well, right? And I mean, there's this little thing that really stands out to me. It looked like it kind of copied it from there, whatever, right? But it works so much better, right? And it works better. Let me see if I can find one in here. Oh no, let's go to, where's somewhere where I have to deal with a lot of people. It's this one. So, you know, living in Hawaii, we don't have private beaches. Private beaches aren't a thing. Oh, here's one, right? So, like, when you're trying to remove things in the background, guys, it's all about how complex the job is, right? So, for example, this is my friend Christine. She just we did her maternity just before I went to Texas. So getting rid of these guys would be pretty easy, even without generative AI, because they're not overlapping, you know, any of my people. Well, let's see how it works, right? Do. Oh, that's weird. It copied his face. This is freaky, right? So the normal one is only going to work so well. If I do the same thing with generative AI, right? Oh, damn it. Boop, boop, boop. Unicorns, magic, whatever. And then works so much better. Let's see about up here, because this is what I would consider to be a complicated Photoshop job. Now, I think even this is asking a lot of generative AI, but, and see, here's the thing about generative AI, guys, is it gives you variations. So you can pick what you want your background to be like, to what it to be like. That's actually not too bad. I always get really amazed at how well it can work. Now, from this image, right, from right here, if I was to show you this image first and I zoomed in, would you be able to tell that this image was photoshopped? Right? Would you be able to tell that there was any photoshopping here? Right? This is my original image. It should pop up here in a second. Oh no, that's the variations. I mean, that one you could probably tell because that variation was weird, right? But like this, where is it? Ah, you get my point. Okay. That is masking. That is the remove tool. Those are some advanced editing techniques, right? We went over the different orders and processes of editing. I think, yeah, I hope that do you guys feel like this makes editing a little bit simpler and easier to understand? Does anybody feel a little bit better about going into editing, moving after this? Right? Any thumbs up?
Yeah, I think it also be easier as we practice more. We
Absolutely.
get into it.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and it's all about repetition, guys. It's all about repetition. Because, all right, I'm gonna stop sharing. Finally back to me. So like I edit thousands of photos a month, right? And well, sorry, I edit hundreds of photos a month. I go through thousands of photos a month, right? During that process, it's not to be like, oh, look at how much more I do than you. It's just a constant effort, it's constant repetition of shooting in different environments, editing photos that were shot in different environments, just finding your style, you know what I mean? Paying attention to what you think is beautiful, what drives you. All that stuff is going to help make editing easier because you're going to be working towards something that speaks to you, right? What I showed you is my editing style. This is my process and style of editing. Cool. If you find a different way that works for you, awesome. Go ahead, run with it, and make it work. One last thing, sorry, two last things that I forgot to explain, and then I'm gonna let you guys go after this. Wait, we got a question. Good question. Do you shoot in D-Log for drone videos? That is it. You're gonna have to message me inside WhatsApp on the side. The answer is yes. But that is a whole other conversation that I need time to explain and go over just because that is a lot. That is a very specific question in itself. One thing I just want to explain real fast, guys, before I let you go, is two things actually. The difference between vibrance and saturation. So saturation, guys, is a global edit. When we raise saturation, it's going to affect the whole image. Oh my God, look at them. Awful, right? Wait, am I sharing my screen? No, I'm not.
No, we can't see it.
Thank you. Yeah, real fast. I'm getting all excited. Okay, so let's reset that real fast. So if we just raise saturation, it's affecting all of the images in our color, or all the color in our images, right? Every single color. Whereas vibrance is going to affect the colors that predominantly take up your image, right? So it's a much more subtle way of boosting color than just adding vibrance, okay? The last thing I'm going to leave you with, so you see this little circle here? When you guys go into your color mix tool, you're going to see what looks like a little crosshair, right? When you click on it, instead of guessing what the colors are, when you touch a part of your screen of your image, you see how my thing's automatically changing as I bring it up and down, right? So you'll touch a part of your screen, your image, and then it's going to tell you what the color is. And then you can adjust it just moving your hand up and down from there. That is a very fast way for you guys to figure out color. That is going to be the easiest way for you to kind of adjust it in that sense. All right, guys, sorry to keep you for too much longer, but any other last minute questions? Anything that anybody wants me to explain real quick? Do we all feel pretty good about editing? Good. Okay.
If we have questions, should we ask over mail or over WhatsApp? What is better?
Either or is fine. Either or is fine. I would say just you have my email listed inside the Google Classroom. If it pertains to oh, perfect. Thank you for writing in here. So if you look inside the comment that I made from yesterday, like if there's things you want to learn more of, that you want more editing material or more learning material about, please post it in a comment in this part, right, inside Google Classroom. If it's a very specific question for yourself, email me or WhatsApp, whatever is fine. And then I'll answer it as best as I can. Okay. Sound good, guys? Everybody feel good? Awesome, guys. Thank you guys so much. I'm really excited to see you guys work moving forward, guys. Yeah, just keep in touch with me if you need anything, okay? All right, everybody. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great Sunday.
Good day. Take care.
Thank you.